Teddy Roosevelt famously said that comparison is the thief of joy. Yet, for most of us, we can't help it. Keep listening as we dive into how your net worth compares to others. Welcome to the Money Meets Medicine podcast, where we talk all about the personal finance topics you wish you had learned in medical school. I'm your host, Dr. Jimmy Turner, and here is our co-host, who is in the midst of a move, but somehow created the time to record this show, Justin Harvey.
Dr. Turner, pleasure to be here as always. If my audio sounds a little more reverberating than usual, it's because I'm sitting in an unfurnished kitchen in an unfurnished house with lots of tile and hardwood everywhere, and I'm getting a lot of echo bouncing all around. So
you know that's what editing is for. And as we go, I'm learning more and more about it. In fact, one of the listeners, Justin, actually a few of them, emailed me and they're like, "Hey, Jimmy, I don't know if you know this or not, but Justin's audio is not working on this one show." And so I got this text like right when I'm like waking up, and I'm like emergency editing like the podcast because somehow it dropped like your MP3 file on that specific recording. And so for those of you that emailed me and let me know that I'm dumb and I somehow missed that when it's saved, thank you for saving me. But we'll get your echo out of the show as best we can.
that's hilarious. Podcasting does take a village, so it's great to have listeners that are looking out for you there.
Yeah, no, it's super helpful, and I love our Money Meets Medicine community. But before we dive into the show, we're going to talk about net worth. We're going to talk about compensation, some surveys that are out there regarding that, how yours compares, and just kind of some overall thoughts about the physician financial landscape. Before we get there, remember that there are multiple reasons to get disability insurance when you're in training. This show is coming out at the end of the academic year. So don't forget that, one reason is that you lock in a lower cost that'll save you thousands of dollars potentially over the time of your policy. Another reason is that you're typically healthiest when you're younger. That's not true for all of us, but that's true for many of us. And so this grants you access to certain policies that you may not have access to if you carry more diagnoses. And then for those of you that know my story, most importantly, you lose access to the guaranteed standard issue policy when you finish training. So in particular, for those of you that have medical problems, maybe you got type 1 diabetes or an autoimmune disease, you carry a cancer diagnosis or some other medical problem, you've had orthopedic procedures, please, if you have medical history, and actually just in general, make sure you get disability insurance before you leave training in case you need the GSI that doesn't look into your medical history. If you need quotes, you need help, you have questions, you just want education on it, you can find all of that at moneymeetsmedicine.com/disability. Request a quote. We're happy to talk to you as often and as much as you need to help you sort through that process. So Justin, on this show, I think we're going to talk about two different Medscape surveys. And I always find these interesting because they come out each year. And the 2024 Physician Compensation Survey just came out a couple months back, which is, the reason that this show is coming up. And so we're going to discuss that and also the 2023 Net Worth Survey because the 2024 one isn't out quite yet. Maybe we'll highlight some of those findings when it does come out. I think it's really cool to have a Medscape membership because you get to see this stuff. And so if you don't, I'm going to plug it. A lot of this is from Medscape. And so, I'm not just stealing their stuff. Go sign up for your own membership and you too can see the images and graphics and information. But this study is 7,000 docs, 30 specialties. And, so it's a pretty representative sample. So Justin, I'm going to be really curious what your thoughts are on this, working with multiple, physician families as a financial planner, actually seeing the inside of their financial life, what actually hits their bank account. But yeah, the average earnings for the U.S. doctor, $363,000 on average for all docs, $277,000 for PCPs, and then about $400,000 for specialists. Is that in the ballpark based on your experience?
Yeah, I mean, yes is the short answer. And they say that the person who on average has his face on a frying pan and his feet in the freezer is on average comfortable. So yes, and I see this is there's obviously a lot of outliers, and I can think of a handful in both specialists and even in the PCP world that. And I think understand well, yeah, or not. And also, along practice ownership lines or business ownership lines, there's some bimodality there as well. But, this is a good and useful starting point. And especially for folks who are like in med school and trying to understand just a ballpark of how does this work and what can I expect economically, I think it's a good starting point.
Yeah, and obviously all the specialties change, and I've shared this on the show recently, but even inside of a single specialty, I mean, I think that when I finished training, you could probably expect to earn somewhere between like 325 to like 375 in academics in anesthesia, and you might earn like 475 or 500 in private practice. This was 8 years ago. There were no signing bonuses, there were no like student loan help, any of that stuff. Now it's like you can earn 350 to 4 in academics, or you can earn 6 or 7 in private practice, depending on your situation and scenario and the job that you find. So that gap is widened significantly just because of fluctuations in the market. And, I'm sure it'll go back to being closer at some point, and the gap will, it kind of ebbs and flows, in my very limited experience so far. But even interspecialty differences, depending on your situation, can be absolutely massive.
Yeah, and the specialties that fall under what is a specialist in air quotes, I think maybe like proceduralist is a better moniker for somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's probably going to be high earning because they're specialists. I talked to one time, I think it was a pediatric nephrologist who I want to say she made like 160 grand or something like that, and I was going through my head thinking about like the amount of time you spend in training in order to do that, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a thing like, well, you should strongly consider PSLF if you're going to do that much work and it's going to take that long. And that person would be considered a specialist. So there's a lot of noise in the data.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. So if you're curious, the highest earning specialties were orthopedics and plastics, which I feel like they battle back and forth for number one and two. They were about 560 to 540 each. And then the lowest, I was a little surprised by this. So endocrine, interestingly, is the lowest on this survey, 256, which is actually less than pediatrics. And speaking of pediatrics, I feel like the one subspecialty that gets ragged on more than any other when it comes to this data is pediatrics infectious disease, PEDS ID. And one of my academic mentors, wonderful, wonderful human being, is a PEDS ID doc. And so we talk about this sometimes and how much he loves his job. And if it weren't for that, like just the compensation doesn't make sense. I think, to my knowledge, and I'm probably wrong about this because of my very limited knowledge in this, it's one of the few specialties where you do a fellowship for like 3 additional years and make less money than the generalist. It's insane.
Well, anesthesia is doing that more now too, depending on the fellowship that you choose. And yeah, you always. I mean, I actually did an episode on fellowships one time. The opportunity cost of making that 70K a year for one extra year,
Yep.
compounded by 25 years, compared to becoming an attending a year earlier, and the difference on and it's like something like $1 million or
It's significant.
1.3.
I've actually
It's
done
a
an
big
article
deal.
on the same exact thing, and people don't realize the income that you're missing out on isn't actually that first year's income. It's your last year's income that you're not getting, one more year of. And so when you start like looking at what you could compound save from the beginning, and also that last paycheck at the end, and potentially other debt increasing while you're still in the process of not being able to pay it off. I mean,
Yep.
it's a pretty large number, and so factoring that into, like, is this, just from a strictly financial standpoint, fellowship worth pursuing? I think it surprises people if they actually sit down and do the math.
Yeah. Now, obviously, in most cases, like clinical preference is going to be the driver because, like, what you actually spend your time doing is more important. And if you can be flexible with how long you work, and if you love every day of your career, then it's no contest. But it is an interesting data point to inform if you're like, I could do a fellowship, I could not, I don't really care. Well, then understand the economic cost in that context because it's not the same between the
Yeah,
two options.
completely. One of the interesting things I found in this study was actually that 61% of doctors felt like they were undercompensated. And one of the conversations that I've been having a lot recently with people is that there's a difference between being well compensated and being fairly compensated. And I think it's the second one that really bothers people, right? Like you are, by every measure, if we look at the globe, the world, being well compensated. You are in the top echelon of earners in the world. Whether you feel like you're fairly compensated is a, let's just say, very different question. That is what I think leads to a lot of this gestalt of feeling undercompensated in medicine that a lot of doctors have. I think this matters because ultimately, really, it comes down to the fact that, like, financial means allows you to do what you want when you want. It's a form of autonomy, but more importantly, compensation, whether we like it or not, has something to do with how we feel appreciated, how we feel valued. That, for the ABCs of self-determination I talk about in my book, Determined, right? Like, this falls squarely in the belonging category of wanting to feel like you matter. And the way that we're compensated, how we're compensated, does determine, whether we like it or not, how valued we feel like our person that's paying us feels we are. And so I kind of understand this. Like, I understand the disgruntlement, and certainly in my very real world life, the people that I talk to, this is definitely a thing.
Yeah. And there's a chart. I'll dig it up and we can throw it in the show notes. One of my favorites. That is the total dollars spent in healthcare, and then total dollars going to clinical salaries, which is like doctors and nurses. And it's something like, I think it's like 19% or 14% or something that I would call egregiously low compared to like what we think about in terms of healthcare cost. And that's another thing that I think makes it a little bit hard to swallow. But I agree. You opened, Jimmy, with this quote about comparison. And certainly I 100% agree with Teddy Roosevelt, the person to whom that quote was attributed, that it can steal your joy, but it can also be an ally if you gave that great stat of like, oh, think about the, 7 point whatever billion people in this world and where you stack up. I like to expand it even chronologically. Think about all the people that have ever lived for all the history of humanity. And as you locate yourself in that spectrum, geographically and economically, it can inform the way that, no, it's not going to make all your problems go away, but it'll help. It'll help the way that you think about what you have and help cultivate a spirit of gratitude, which is hugely, I think it will help you in every way, really.
Yeah, that's one of the things we teach in coaching, right? Is that and this comes from Stoic philosophy, that you can't control things that are external to you, but you can control your internal narrative about those external circumstances. And that if you change your perspective on it, like, there really is a lot of work that can be done to really, appreciate your current situation, and with some perspective, actually not change where you are, what you're being paid, that sort of thing, to really feel differently about where you are. I think it's like any other thing in life. It takes a lot of work and practice to really hammer that home. But I completely agree. This compensation study showed that compensation by and large has been going up by 4 to 5% over the last couple of years, which I find interesting because that has not been reflected in some of the lives that I know personally. But that's what the study says. And yet, does it have a correlation with an increase in net worth based on prior surveys? Well, Medscape did that one too, right? So 10,000 respondents, 70%. This is crazy. 70% of the people in this study were older than 45. So, you're talking about people that are at least 10 years out of training for the vast majority of them, right? Maybe you had a non-traditional career. That's not your situation. But for the vast majority of doctors, 45 years old, you've probably been out of training for at least 10 years. The specialties varied. Family medicine was 12%. IM was 13%. The perioperative specialties were somewhere between, 1 and 10%. That said, if you look at this survey and you add up the number of docs that, have more than, let's say, $2 million, it's about 40% of those docs, and 70%, so 7,000 of these doctors are older than 45. And if you carry that to $1 million, $1 million in net worth, right? Now all of a sudden you're sitting around 60%. I find this really interesting because this net worth includes all of the money in your savings accounts. It includes your home, like the equity, and with the recent surge in, home prices, you'd think that would drive this dramatically up compared to where it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I'm always blown away by the numbers in this, and the fact that 41% of people don't have $1 million in net worth 10 to 15 years out after training. For me, that's a little mind blowing.
Yeah, and I just did a quick little chart review here of the S&P 500, and in the last 10 years, the S&P is up about 177%. So if somebody has been saving during that amount of time, you've gotten a nice tailwind of almost doubling the money that you put in, at least at the beginning. And so, yeah, there's a lot of economic help that you get between inflation, helping your home value, stock market going up over time. And, Jimmy, this is not probably a surprise. It's interesting to observe, but it's probably not a surprise. While there are these tailwinds, there's also headwinds for physicians that they're, what we see is the peer group that they hang out with most frequently is like people who, and we've talked about this, like, don't assume that the goals of the other people in the OR or in your practice are the same as your goals. And so as you observe their spending and their lifestyle, don't assume that you should mirror that, because there's going to be trade-offs. And when everyone around you is doing a certain thing, and that thing is spending money on lifestyle today rather than saving for tomorrow. Now, obviously, these are not totally mutually exclusive. But when people are spending more than they're saving on a regular basis, when you're in that peer group, you're an outlier. You have to swim upstream. You have to have a different mindset, and you have to continue to reaffirm for yourself what you're doing in order to make that work over time. So that context to me makes it kind of make sense.
Yeah, no, I get it. I really do. But just crunching some numbers, right? Popping this thing into a calculator. If you save $50,000 per year and you just get 8% annualized, you'd have $1.5 million in 15 years. You'd have $800,000 in 10. And so it's like if the average salary is 400 grand, give or take, you're talking about $50,000. It's like what, 12% of your income, right? I mean, like this is not a massive number. Like you max out your 401k, your 403b, and then maybe you get some additional matching. Like that doesn't even have to come from you. It could come from your
And that
employer.
probably almost gets you there. Yeah.
It
To that
does.
50
I mean, it's
number.
like this
Yep.
$1 million net worth. So like really what this is saying is that physicians aren't saving at least $50,000 a year. And I mean, that's to me, it's like, I'm not saying that there aren't things that are going on in people's lives that prevent them from saving as much money. Like certainly there are, student loans and auto debt and, a whole slew of other things. Maybe you live in a super high cost of living area and you just, it's really, really hard for you to save that amount of money. But I do think it is just interesting, as you put it, to observe this phenomenon. And this is just 8%. It's not 200.
Another thing, Jimmy, is if you overlay sort of the sociological dynamics and think about how many people are staying married to the same person from age 28 to 48, if there's a double digit percentage, I don't know exactly how big it is. I think in medicine it's higher than the average of 50%. People getting divorced, and then you get a third, and then your spouse gets a third, and then the lawyers get a third. That is a huge ding to your net worth, and I'd be curious to understand how much that represents here.
Yeah, I don't know, and I honestly didn't think about that. One thing, obviously, that can drive down your ability to save is how much you're spending. This is the one area where I'm like, how much do I trust this survey? Right? Because there's obviously some bias here in terms of people's responses, but only 7% of people in the survey said that they lived above their means. I'm just going to tell you from my very anecdotal experience working with thousands of doctors and getting to know their stories at this point, that is not an accurate number. It's just not. Like a very large portion of physicians live above their means. And let's just define that as not saving 15% of your income, right? Like if you're not saving 15% of your income, you could do better, right? And so and again, that's a barometer. It's a rule of thumb. It's a guide. In fact, I encourage people to save sometimes 20 or 30% of their income, particularly in their early years, because as we discussed in a prior episode, I'm a huge fan of Coast Fire. We now save $50,000, $60,000 a year. We used to save 100. I don't have to save any more money, and I could retire by the age of 65 because I saved a lot of money early. And so when I see this survey saying that 7% say they live above their means, and even better, 42% they said they live below their means. I'm like, I don't know. 10,000 doctors, 7%. I don't know.
I would imagine that the people that are most ashamed and feeling overwhelmed about money, the last thing they want to do is sit down and answer a 37 question Medscape survey about their personal finances. So I'm sure there's some selection bias here. And probably the people who are stressed about finances, who think they are living beyond their means, they would define that as like, oh, I have more credit card debt than I can pay off in a month. And as you and I know, Jimmy, that doesn't mean you live beyond your means. That means you're like way out. You're so far out on the branch that you're very financially unhealthy. It's not just beyond your means. It's like you're kind of in crisis mode. And like, God forbid you get hurt or something happens, then you're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yeah, your host. And that's the interesting thing, right? So like not I don't even need to go to like my anecdotal experience talking to thousands of doctors at this point. In the same survey, 7% said that they overspend, right? They spend more than their means. And yet in this survey, 25% of doctors had revolving credit card debt that they were paying down. It's like by definition, like you're either a liar or you're not being honest with yourself, or maybe you're just not financially literate to realize that 20% APR on a credit card means that by definition you're living beyond your means. Now maybe you're paying that off from when you were in training and training was tough. You lived in a high cost of living area, in California while you were in training, and you had to get some credit card debt. But remember, 70% of people in the survey were over the age of 45. This isn't the 35-year-old that's still paying off credit card debt because they graduated last year from training. So the numbers, I just find it fascinating that 25% of physicians, most of which 7,000 of them were over the age of 45, carry revolving credit card debt.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway that I take from this body of information or data, I don't know if it's information. There's a lot of noise. It's hard to really
It is.
interpret.
It
There's
is.
some talking points, but I think that the self knowledge of physicians about their personal finances, as you're pointing out these like fundamental mismatches, it's low, and so it's a good time to say, "Hey, doctor, it's okay to not know. It's
Yep.
okay to even not be financially healthy, but this is a great opportunity to take stock and say, like, how much do I know? And get a book, take a course, read, educate yourself. Listen to this. Listeners of this podcast they're probably already ahead of the curve, but share this with one of your friends who's stressed out about money, or somebody in the OR, or somebody at your practice who is talking about, oh my gosh, like my car payment is starting to stress me out because we get to the end of the month. Like, there is an education gap here. And I think that if 7% think they're beyond their means and 25% have credit card debt, like, unless you just came out of training, or that's a 0% thing that you're doing tactically as a part of a strategy, like, there's huge swaths of doctors that really would benefit from some basic financial literacy. And, frankly, Jimmy, that's why this show is such a great service to your peers, spreading very important information. So hopefully docs can not continue to make fundamental errors in how they manage their money.
Yeah, I completely agree. And my buddy Fad Ahmad, he's a pediatric emergency medicine physician at WashU in St. Louis, did a study looking at financial literacy. His focus more on investing, and then Fad and I did another study that looked at student loans. And it was a little mind blowing to me. This was probably 3 or 4 years ago, but even in that study, true or false format, 50% of the people didn't know that public service loan forgiveness was tax-free forgiveness. It's like you had a 50% chance to get it right, and I think more than 50% missed it. And so like there definitely is a financial literacy gap, which is why Money Meets Medicine exists. It is why I give away my book completely free on the website. Right? Is financial literacy is so important, in particular in the setting of physician burnout and the need for empowerment and the need for you to have autonomy and to take control of your life and the practice of medicine that you practice. This is a fundamentally important thing that I think is linked to the success of medicine, in my opinion. And that's why I and we are so passionate about this topic.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things where when you begin to take these basic sort of baby steps towards a solid financial foundation, it does the things that you need to get from your work. The expectations can go down economically because you have the bandwidth, you have the margin, you have the moat, you have the protection of good financial habits that over time build to your benefit. And then whenever the time for the cost of living adjustment comes around every year and it's 1% and inflation was 9% last year and all these things are moving in the wrong direction, you don't have to continue to work 1.0 FTE in that world because of the things that you've done. You're moving towards freedom for yourself and your family, even if you are one of the highest paid people ever in the history of humanity. If we look at things globally, like, your life is your life, and compare that kind of like awareness is helpful, but proactive steps are necessary in order to get the freedom that you're really looking for.
Yeah, so I think the take home here is, these are just numbers. There's lots of noise in this data. Where you are is going to be your own personal journey, because personal finance is personal. But ultimately, having that financial literacy foundation is fundamentally important. And I think this is something that's important enough for the purpose of medicine continuing, and for, honestly, for the toxic culture that exists in a lot of places to get better. Physicians need to be financially able to stand up for the change that medicine needs. And so please, please, please share the show, share the free book on moneymeetsmedicine.com with your friends. It is on there. They can download it. They can read it. It's a really short read. There are lots of other books out there that can help you do the same. You might engage the services of a financial advisor. We've talked about that in a recent episode. If you're interested in learning more about that, I think it was like last couple weeks, actually. And so, yeah, we appreciate you being a part of the community and sharing this with people, because this is really important. And hopefully some of this data gave you some insight on that. Maybe this is data that reflects your current situation. Maybe it's not. I'm not really sure. But regardless, there's a way forward. There's a path where you can find success. And ultimately, I think that's going to make medicine and the care of our patients better for it. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you tagging along and listening to Justin and I, him and Haw, on the Medscape surveys and the current landscape of physician compensation and net worth. We will see you next week. Cheers. Justin Harvey is a certified financial planner at APM Wealth, where he helps anesthesiologists and pain medicine physicians. Dr. Jimmy Turner is a practicing academic anesthesiologist at Wake Forest in North Carolina. He's also a licensed insurance agent. However, either Justin or Jimmy are your financial planner, investment advisor, or insurance agent. This show is expressly for general education and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be considered financial advice. All views expressed are solely the views of the guests on this show and do not represent the views or opinions of their employer.